The rain came down in sheets over the glass towers of the financial district, and Ethan Carter stood on the rooftop of the building he no longer owned, staring at a man he used to call his brother. "You should have stayed useful, Ethan," Daniel Cross said, water running down his expensive coat. "Instead you kept digging." Ethan's hands were empty, his phone was gone, taken by the two men who had escorted him up here under the pretense of a private conversation. His company was gone, signed away in pieces over 18 months of forged signatures and manipulated board votes. His marriage was gone, ended the moment he'd walked in on his wife and his best friend in the office he'd built with his own hands. "I trusted you," Ethan said. "It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was just a fact spoken the way a man might note that it was still raining." "That was your mistake," Daniel said. "Not mine." Below them, the city glittered, indifferent. Somewhere in that skyline was the penthouse Sophia now shared with Daniel, the one Ethan had put a down payment on 9 years ago, back when he'd believed love was something you built one long night at a time. "She never loved the man I became," Ethan said quietly, remembering the words Sophia had thrown at him the day everything broke. "But she loved the man I was still building for her." Daniel stepped closer, and there was no more pretense in his face, only the flat calculation of a man closing a transaction. "Why, oh, we're useful," he said, "but you were never exceptional. Sophia understood that a long time before you did." Ethan didn't see the shove coming, or maybe he did, and some tired part of him didn't try to stop it. There was a half-second where the city lights spun beneath him like static, and in that half-second his whole life arranged itself into a single, unbearable thought. "If I could start again, I would never make the same choices." Then there was only the fall, and then there was nothing. Ethan opened his eyes. Sunlight. A ceiling he hadn't seen in 10 years, the smell of instant coffee and cheap laundry detergent. His hands, young hands, unscarred, unshaking, were resting on top of a comforter he recognized with a jolt that stole the air from his lungs. His university apartment. The one he'd left the week after he proposed to Sophia. He sat up so fast his head spun. On the desk across the room sat a laptop he hadn't touched in a decade, its plastic shell still glossy, no scratches yet on the lid. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, an old model, a cracked case he remembered replacing 3 separate times. He picked it up with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The date on the screen made his stomach drop through the floor. 10 years earlier, not the day he'd met Sophia, not some vague, safe distance in the past where he could rebuild his life from nothing. 6 months before he would kneel down in a restaurant with too many candles and ask Sophia Bennett to marry him. They were already together. Already 4 years deep into a relationship that in the life he remembered would curdle slowly and then all at once. Daniel was still his best friend, the man who would, in another version of this exact year, stand beside him as his best man before eventually replacing him entirely. Nothing had happened yet. Ethan sat on the edge of his old bed, his heart hammering, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he hadn't been given a new life. He'd been given the same one. With all the knowledge of how it ends. Chapter 1. The phone rang before Ethan had even decided what to do with the impossible fact of being alive. Sophia lit up the screen, and for a moment he just stared at it, letting it ring, because some part of his brain refused to believe her voice would sound the way it used to, soft, uncomplicated, before any of it went wrong. He answered. "You haven't texted me back in an hour," she said, and there was real worry in it, the kind he hadn't heard from her in years by the time everything ended. "Are you okay?" "Why oh sound weird?" He recognized her voice instantly. The same voice that would one day tell him, flat and tired, "You were never the man I wanted," but that woman didn't exist yet. This Sophia was 24, ambitious, and as far as she knew, still building a future with him. "I'm fine," Ethan said, because it was easier than the truth, and because he genuinely didn't know yet what the truth was. "You still love me, right?" she asked, half joking, half serious, the way people ask questions they already assume have good answers. Ethan looked at the water-stained ceiling of an apartment he'd forgotten he'd ever lived in and thought about a rooftop and rain, and the last thing he'd ever say to her in another life. "I don't know anymore," he said. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. It was the first crack, small, almost invisible, in a relationship that in his memory would take 9 more years to break completely. He hadn't meant to put it there, he simply hadn't had time to build the lie. "That's not funny," Sophia said finally. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and meant it, though not for the reason she thought. "Rough morning. I'll call you later." He hung up before she could argue and sat there in the quiet, running his thumb over the cracked corner of a phone screen he'd once thrown across a hotel room in fury. In a year that, as far as the universe was concerned, hadn't happened yet. He tested it cautiously the way a man tests ice before trusting his full weight to it. He walked to the corner store 3 blocks from his apartment, a store he remembered would be replaced by a pharmacy in exactly 2 years, and bought a newspaper with shaking hands, just to see the date printed in black and white, confirmed by something other than his own phone. It was real, or it was the most convincing delusion a dying brain had ever produced. Either way, Ethan understood he only had one sane option: act as though it was real and see what happened. He spent that first day walking through streets he hadn't seen in this condition for a decade, streets that were, impossibly, exactly as he remembered them being back then, not as they'd later become. The coffee shop on 5th that would close during a recession still 3 years away. The construction site that would eventually become the tower where he'd sign away his company, still just an empty lot with a chain-link fence. He didn't tell anyone about the fall or the rooftop or the 10 years he'd apparently just skipped backward through. Who would believe him? He barely believed himself. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense to a man who'd just been handed something between a miracle and a curse. He started making a list, not of things to buy or people to punish, a list of dates. The night he'd catch Daniel and Sophia together, 3 years and 4 months from now, in the office above the design studio. The name of the company Daniel would convince him to invest in, the one that would collapse and take a third of his savings with it. The quarter his own company's board would begin quietly voting against him, months before he even noticed anything was wrong. Each memory came back sharper than he expected, and each one hurt in a new way, because for the first time he was remembering them not as scars but as warnings. He was 25 years old, sitting in an apartment with peeling paint, holding a decade of pain he hadn't yet earned and a decade of foresight nobody deserved. If I could start again, he'd thought, falling. Now he had to figure out what again actually meant. Flashback: the boardroom 9 years from now. Ethan remembered it in fragments, the way you remember the worst day of your life. Fluorescent light, a table full of men who wouldn't meet his eyes. A stack of papers with his own signature on them that he didn't remember signing, until Daniel quietly reminded him he'd initialed each page during a late night 18 months earlier, half-drunk, trusting the man beside him to summarize the terms correctly. He hadn't checked, he'd trusted. That single failure to check had cost him 30% of a company he'd spent a decade building. He would not make that mistake again. He didn't yet know what mistake would replace it. But he knew, sitting in that old apartment with the newspaper still in his hands, that trust without verification had been the wound underneath every other wound in his first life. And he intended to find every place he'd once left himself unguarded, and close it, one at a time, before anyone had the chance to walk through it again. Chapter 2. He didn't confront Sophia. He didn't accuse her of anything. In this timeline, she hadn't done anything yet, and Ethan was determined, however impossible it felt, not to punish a person for a crime that existed only in his memory. Instead, he watched. He met her for dinner 2 nights later at the noodle place near her apartment, the one that would close down in 6 years and reopen as a bank branch. She talked about her fledgling fashion label with the same restless, contagious energy he remembered falling in love with. The sketches spread across her kitchen table. The fabric swatches she carried in her bag like other people carried snacks. She was smart. She was funny when she let her guard down. She reached across the table twice to steal food off his plate without asking, the way she always had before she stopped doing even small things like that. Watching her now, Ethan noticed something he hadn't let himself see the first time around. How much of his own attention had drifted, even back then. How many dinners in his memory he'd spent checking his phone for supplier emails instead of listening to her talk about pattern cutting. How many times she'd asked him a direct question about her work and he'd answered with something about his own. He hadn't caused what she eventually did. Nothing excused it: the years of lying, the money moved behind his back, the nights she'd told him she was working late while she was somewhere else entirely with a man he trusted like a brother. But sitting across from her now, Ethan made himself admit something he'd never once considered in his first life. He had not been an innocent bystander in his own marriage's slow collapse. He had been absent in the ways that mattered long before she was. It didn't make her betrayal smaller, it made his choices this time heavier. "You're staring," Sophia said, smiling, pulling him out of it. "Just thinking that I don't tell you enough how good your work is," he said, and meant it, and watched something in her face soften in a way it hadn't in years by the time he died. He walked her home that night and didn't kiss her goodnight the way he used to, automatically, out of habit, but stopped at her door and actually looked at her, trying to see the difference between the woman standing in front of him and the one who would, in another version of events, hand his life to another man piece by piece. He didn't know yet if they were the same person. That question would take him the better part of a year to answer honestly. Over the following weeks, Ethan made himself do something he'd never bothered doing the first time. He learned Sophia's business the way he expected her to learn his. He sat in on her fabric sourcing calls. He read the supplier contracts she'd been agonizing over, not to control them, but to actually understand what she was building. She noticed, and it visibly moved her, not because he was suddenly useful to her in a practical sense, but because he was finally curious about a part of her life he'd spent 4 years treating as background noise to his own. "You've never asked this many questions about the business," she said one night, surprised, pleased, a little suspicious in the way people get when good attention arrives without an obvious cause. "I should have asked a long time ago," Ethan said, and meant every word of it, even if she could never understand exactly how long a time he meant. There were good nights in those early months, nights Ethan hadn't remembered clearly the first time around, because the good nights of a marriage rarely survive as vividly as the bad ones once the whole thing has collapsed. He remembered now, watching her sketch late into the night, the particular focus on her face when a design finally clicked into place. He remembered laughing with her over nothing in particular, the easy rhythm two people build when they aren't yet keeping score. It made the question harder, not easier, because the woman he was falling back in love with, carefully and against his own better judgment, was also undeniably the same woman capable of what came later. He didn't resolve the contradiction. He simply carried it, the way he was learning to carry most things in this second life. Openly, and without pretending it didn't weigh anything. Chapter 3, Pretending was the hardest part. Daniel Cross showed up at Ethan's apartment 2 days later with a six-pack and the same easy grin he'd worn at Ethan's wedding, at Ethan's father's funeral. And in a memory Ethan couldn't unsee no matter how hard he tried, in the doorway of an office at 11 at night with Sophia's blouse half unbuttoned behind him. "You look like hell," Daniel said, dropping onto the second-hand couch like he owned it. "Sophia said you've been acting strange." "Bad week," Ethan said, and took the beer and made himself smile because the man sitting across from him hadn't done anything wrong yet. Not in this life. Not for another 3 years. It was, Ethan would later realize, the single hardest performance of his life, sitting across from his best friend, drinking with him, laughing at his jokes, while a memory sat behind his ribs like a knife. This same man's hand on his wife's waist, this same man's voice explaining, almost bored, that Ethan had been useful but never exceptional. He couldn't punish Daniel for a future crime. He could only quietly make sure that crime became harder to commit. There were moments, sitting across from Daniel, when Ethan almost let himself hope the future could be avoided entirely. That maybe, in a life where Ethan simply paid closer attention, Daniel would never become the man Ethan remembered. He watched for signs of the person Daniel would eventually be, and mostly found instead an ordinary friend. Generous with his time, quick with a joke when Ethan was stressed. The kind of person who remembered small details about your life and brought them up months later just to show he'd been listening. It was, in its own way, worse than if Daniel had shown obvious warning signs from the start. It meant the eventual betrayal wouldn't come from a monster Ethan could have spotted early. It would come from an ordinary man who simply, gradually, decided he wanted something that wasn't his. "You've gotten quiet lately," Daniel said one night, midway through a game of cards neither of them was paying much attention to. "Everything okay with you and Sophia?" "We're fine," Ethan said automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, can I ask you something honestly?" "Always. If you ever wanted something I had, really wanted it, the kind of want that doesn't go away, would you tell me? Or would you just take it?" Daniel laughed, waving the question off as a strange philosophical tangent brought on by too many beers. "What kind of question is that? I'd tell you, obviously. We don't keep secrets, man." Ethan smiled and let the moment pass, and told himself that Daniel's easy answer meant nothing yet, because the man giving it hadn't been tested by anything real. He filed the conversation away anyway, the way he'd learned to file almost everything now, not as proof, but as one more small data point in a pattern he was determined to see clearly before it was too late to matter. Over the following weeks, Ethan began pulling threads he'd never noticed the first time, because the first time he hadn't been looking. He stopped giving Daniel the passwords to shared accounts he used to hand over without thinking. He stopped looping him into early-stage business plans to keep things simple. He let 2 investment opportunities pass by without mentioning them to Daniel at all, including, deliberately, the one that in his memory Daniel would later use to worm his way deeper into Ethan's finances. Daniel noticed, of course he noticed. He'd always been sharp enough eventually to steal a company out from under Ethan without leaving fingerprints. "What's changed between us?" Daniel asked one night, an edge under the casual tone. "Nothing," Ethan said. "I'm just growing up, figured I should stop treating my finances like a group project." Daniel laughed it off, but Ethan saw something flicker behind his eyes, not guilt, because there was nothing yet to feel guilty about but a kind of recalculation. The first small adjustment of a man who was used to being let all the way in, discovering a door had quietly, politely been left ajar instead. Ethan didn't sleep well that night. It was one thing to know in the abstract that his best friend would one day betray him. It was another to sit across from him, share a beer, laugh at an old joke, and feel the whole friendship already curling at the edges, not because of anything Daniel had done, but because Ethan could no longer unknow what he knew. Chapter 4, the email arrived exactly when Ethan remembered it would. A Tuesday mid-morning subject line promising the opportunity of a lifetime from a logistics startup Daniel had gotten wildly enthusiastic about in his first life. Ethan remembered the pitch deck almost word for word. He'd stared at its collapse often enough in the years afterward, doing the math on what that money could have become if he'd simply said no. This time he said no. Daniel pushed harder than Ethan expected, genuinely believing in the deal, which made it worse in a way. This wasn't malice yet. Just an honest mistake dressed up as ambition. Why you're being paranoid, Daniel told him over lunch. This is the kind of thing that makes careers. I've got a bad feeling, Ethan said, which was true in the driest possible sense. Instead, using money he remembered from a very different disaster, Ethan quietly put a modest stake into a small e-commerce logistics company 2 neighborhoods over. One he recalled vaguely, becoming a name everyone would know within 5 years. He didn't tell Daniel, he didn't tell Sophia, he barely believed it himself until the first quarterly numbers came back better than anyone but Ethan could have predicted. It wasn't a fortune. Not yet. But it was proof of something Ethan hadn't let himself fully believe until that moment, sitting alone with a spreadsheet at 2 in the morning. The future wasn't fixed. It bent when you pushed on it. He called his father that same week, mostly to hear his voice. A small, selfish comfort. Given that Ethan remembered exactly how many years his father had left, a number he'd never told a single living soul and never would. His father, a practical man who'd spent 30 years running a hardware store and distrusted anything he couldn't hold in his hands, was characteristically unimpressed by the investment news. Money that appears out of nowhere usually disappears the same way, his father said. Slow down. Build something real before you start trusting numbers on a screen. I hear you, Ethan said, and meant it more than his father could have known because slowing down, checking twice. Trusting nothing blindly, that was exactly the lesson this entire second life was trying to teach him, delivered now in his father's blunt, practical voice instead of the expensive one Ethan had learned it in the first time around. You sound different lately, his father added almost as an afterthought. Older, feels that way some days, Ethan said and left it there, grateful for a conversation that asked nothing of him but honesty about the parts of himself he could actually explain. He realized something else too, something that would shape every decision he made from that point forward. He didn't need to fight his enemies. He didn't need confrontations or accusations or proof he didn't have yet. He simply needed to make their future impossible, to quietly remove the ladders they hadn't yet realized they'd need to climb. 6 weeks later, the logistics startup Daniel had pushed for collapsed almost exactly the way Ethan remembered, taking 2 of Daniel's other investors down with it. Daniel wasn't touched, he'd been careful with his own money, careless only with Ethan's in a life that no longer existed. Lucky you didn't get in on that one, Daniel said, visibly rattled for the first time Ethan could remember. Guess I got lucky, Ethan said and didn't explain further. Flashback, the year everything fell apart in the life that no longer existed here. Ethan remembered, with the particular clarity reserved for financial disasters, the week the logistics startup's collapse had wiped out nearly a third of his liquid savings. Savings he'd been counting on to weather a slow quarter at his own company. He remembered explaining it to Sophia, watching her face carefully for disappointment she hadn't quite bothered to hide. He remembered Daniel, in that same conversation, offering sympathy that in hindsight had never been sympathy at all, but the first careful measurement of exactly how vulnerable Ethan had just become. He'd taken a loan that quarter in his first life to cover the gap. A loan Daniel had personally helped him structure, generous and reassuring, and Ethan now understood, the very first thread in a rope that would eventually strangle the whole company. He remembered signing the paperwork gratefully, thanking Daniel for making a hard month easier. None of that had happened this time. There was no gap to cover, no loan to sign, no grateful trust extended to a man who would have used it as a foothold. Ethan sat with that realization for a long while, turning it over the way he turned over most of his memories now, not as wounds anymore, but as evidence of a life he'd successfully, carefully, dismantled piece by piece before it could ever happen again. Sophia noticed the difference in him most of all, a new steadiness, a confidence that didn't come from anywhere she could name. Her family, who had spent years looking down on Ethan for not having enough money to matter, started asking about him at dinners instead of around him. It should have felt like vindication. Mostly, it felt like standing at the edge of something he didn't fully understand yet, watching the shape of his life change under his own hands for the first time. He was careful, though, not to let the early win make him reckless. He remembered, painfully, how easy it had been in his first life to mistake one good outcome for permanent proof he understood the game. So he built rules for himself instead of chasing more lucky guesses. Verify everything twice, put nothing in a shared account he couldn't afford to lose alone, and never again sign a document he hadn't read line by line himself. no matter how late the hour or how much he trusted the person handing him the pen. Sophia's father, a stiff, humorless man who had never once in Ethan's first life offered him so much as a compliment, invited him to lunch for the first time in 4 years of dating his daughter. Ethan sat across from him in a steakhouse that would, in another version of events, host the dinner where Sophia's family finally, formally welcomed Daniel into the fold instead. "You've been making some interesting moves," her father said, cutting into his steak without looking up. "Didn't expect that from you." "I didn't expect it either," Ethan said honestly. "Sophia's mother thinks you've changed. I think you've just started paying attention." The old man finally looked up, something almost like respect in his expression. "Don't stop." Ethan didn't tell him that paying attention was the least he owed anyone after a decade of not doing it well enough the first time. Chapter 5, in the life Ethan remembered, this was the month he proposed. He remembered every detail with an unbearable clarity: the restaurant, the ring he'd nearly bankrupted himself buying, the way Sophia had cried and said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. He remembered how happy he'd been. He remembered, just as clearly, standing on a rooftop 9 years later listening to that same woman tell him he was never the man she wanted. He didn't buy a ring. Sophia noticed the anniversary of their 4th year passing without the conversation she'd clearly been expecting. He saw it in the careful way she brought up a coworker's engagement, in the pause she left for him to say something. He didn't feel it. "Do you still want to marry me?" She finally asked him directly, 3 weeks later, in the kitchen of her apartment, flour on her hands from a recipe she'd never finished making in his memory because they'd been too busy planning a wedding. Ethan owed her honesty even if he couldn't give her the whole truth. "I don't know if we're good for each other," he said, "not the way we should be." "Where is this coming from?" Her voice cracked on the last word. 4 years, Ethan, why ooh of never once." "I know," he said. "That's on me too. I think I've spent 4 years assuming we'd be fine as long as I worked hard enough. I don't think that's the same as actually being fine." It wasn't a lie. It was, if anything, the truest thing he'd said to her since he woke up in this life. Sophia was devastated in a way that surprised him, not performed, not strategic, just raw. Whatever she would eventually become, whatever choices waited for her 3 years down the road, the woman crying in that kitchen loved him or believed she did, and Ethan hated that he couldn't tell her why he was doing this. He couldn't tell her that in another version of their lives, this same kitchen would one day host a different scene entirely. Daniel's jacket on the back of a chair that wasn't his, 6 years from tonight. "I'm not leaving you," Ethan said carefully. "I'm just not ready to promise you forever when I'm not sure yet what forever with me even looks like." It didn't satisfy her. It wasn't supposed to. But it bought him something he desperately needed: time and the freedom to find out, really find out, not just guess from the ashes of a life already lived. Whether the woman standing in front of him was the same one who would eventually destroy him, or someone still capable of becoming someone else entirely. He walked home that night carrying a grief he hadn't expected. Not for the future he was avoiding, but for the proposal he wasn't giving her, the one she still, in this moment, genuinely wanted. Her mother called him 2 days later, which had never happened in his first life. Sophia's family had always treated him as an obstacle to root around rather than a man worth addressing directly. "She won't tell us what's wrong," her mother said, her voice tight with the particular anxiety of a parent watching a daughter's certainty crack. "Did something happen between you two?" "Nothing happened," Ethan said. "I just don't think either of us should promise forever until we've actually earned it. I'd rather disappoint her now than fail her later." There was a long pause on the line. "That's a strange thing for a young man in love to say." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I think it's the honest one." He didn't tell her, couldn't tell her, that he'd already failed her daughter later in a version of events only he remembered, and that the entire reason he was disappointing her now was to make sure that failure never had the chance to happen again. Some nights in the quiet after these conversations, the weight of carrying an entire unspoken history by himself pressed down on him hard enough that he understood freshly why people in stories like his so rarely stayed silent about what they knew. It would have been so much easier to simply explain everything. He never did. Some truths, he decided, weren't his to hand to someone who hadn't lived through them. Chapter 6, Claire Bennett existed at the edges of Ethan's memory of his first life. A name on emails he barely read, a face at industry mixers he'd left early. He remembered her when he remembered her at all, as the sharp young analyst who'd once tried to warn him about irregularities in Daniel's accounting, months before everything collapsed. He'd brushed her off then. Politely but completely, he'd been too deep inside his own denial to hear a stranger tell him what he already suspected and refused to face. This time, he sought her out. She worked at a boutique investment firm 3 floors below the office where Ethan was quietly building his second, independent portfolio, the one Daniel knew nothing about. Their first real conversation happened over a shared elevator ride and a spilled coffee. Mundane enough that Ethan almost laughed at how unremarkable the beginning of the most important relationship of his life turned out to be. "You're the one who put money into Fentridge Logistics before anyone else touched it," Claire said, dabbing coffee off her sleeve with a napkin he'd handed her. "That was either very smart or very lucky, bit of both," Ethan said. "There's no such thing as luck in this business," she said, not unkindly. "Just people who did their homework and people who didn't." He liked her immediately and made himself be careful about it because he knew exactly what he wanted this relationship to become, and he refused to let that knowledge turn her into a shortcut. Their second real conversation happened at an industry mixer neither of them wanted to be at, both of them hovering near the exit with drinks they weren't drinking. "Why look like you'd rather be anywhere else," Claire observed. "I'd rather be home reading annual reports," Ethan admitted, "which probably says something concerning about me." "It says you have taste," Claire said. "Most of the people in this room haven't read a balance sheet in years. They pay other people to have opinions for them." "Is that what you do, have opinions for people?" "I have opinions at people," she corrected, "whether they asked for them or not. It's gotten me in trouble more than once." "I could use more people willing to do that," Ethan said, and meant it more than the joke suggested. They ended up leaving the mixer together, not romantically. Just two people equally relieved to escape a room full of small talk, and spent an hour at a diner nearby arguing amiably about whether a company's culture mattered more than its balance sheet in predicting long-term success. Claire argued culture. Ethan argued numbers. Neither of them won, and both of them, without quite admitting it to themselves yet, left the conversation looking forward to the next one. Claire didn't know she was destined for anything. She didn't know Ethan's history or hers in a version of the world she'd never lived through. She was simply a woman building a career, sharp enough to see through bad numbers and unimpressed by wealth she hadn't personally verified. Their conversations became a habit before either of them called it anything else, coffee that turned into lunch, a shared frustration about a mutual client that turned into an hour on the phone. Claire argued with him. She told him when his projections were sloppy. She once spent 20 minutes dismantling an assumption he'd built an entire investment thesis around, and he'd walked away from that conversation smarter and unexpectedly happier than he'd been in weeks. He remembered with a strange, quiet ache that in his first life he had ignored this exact woman when she'd tried to warn him about Daniel's numbers. He'd been too married, too certain, too tired to listen. He wasn't going to make that mistake twice. Claire didn't fall for him quickly, and he didn't push her to. She liked him when she eventually admitted it to herself because he listened, really listened, the way almost no one in her professional life bothered to, and because he never once tried to make himself bigger in her presence to compensate for anything. She told him much later that the moment she'd actually started paying attention to him as more than a colleague was small and unremarkable. A Tuesday afternoon when he'd corrected his own mistake in front of a client, rather than let her take the blame for a number she hadn't actually gotten wrong. "Most men in this industry would have let it slide," she said. "Y.O. didn't even hesitate." "It wasn't a hard call," Ethan said. "It was just true." "You'd be surprised how rarely that's the same thing for most people," Claire said. Ethan began to understand, slowly, and with a kind of quiet devastation, that the woman he'd overlooked in his first life might have been the one who was right for him the entire time. There was a night 3 months into their careful, undefined friendship when Claire finally asked him the question he'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "You're engaged, aren't you?" she said, not quite a question. "Or close to it." "Not anymore," Ethan said. "We're still together, I don't know for how long." "That's a strange way to talk about someone you're with." "It's been a strange year," he said, which was the truest sentence he owned. Claire studied him for a long moment, the same careful scrutiny she gave a set of numbers that didn't quite add up. "I'm not interested in being someone's exit plan," she said finally, not unkindly, but with a bluntness he respected more than he could say. "If you're working something out, work it out. I like talking to you. I'm not going to compete with a relationship I don't understand." "That's fair," Ethan said, and admired her more for saying it than he would have if she'd simply let the ambiguity sit unspoken between them the way most people did. He didn't chase her after that. He gave her exactly what she'd asked for: clarity, patience, no pressure, and found, months later, that the space he'd given her had done more to build something real between them than any grand gesture could have. Chapter 7. Sophia noticed Claire before Ethan ever mentioned her. It wasn't hard. Ethan's calendar had a new name in it 3 times a week, and Sophia, for all her flaws, was not unobservant. She brought it up at dinner with a lightness that didn't quite land. "Who's Claire?" she asked, twirling pasta she wasn't eating. "Someone I work with, smart. She's caught 2 bad deals for me already." "That's not what I asked." Ethan set down his fork. He could have lied. In another life, lying would have been easier. He was, after all, already carrying secrets no honest man should have to keep. But he'd promised himself something when he woke up in that old apartment. Whatever else changed, he wasn't going to become someone who cheated, wasn't going to let jealousy or fear turn him into the man he'd spent a decade hating. "There's nothing happening," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't respect her, but nothing's happening." It was true in the narrowest, most literal sense, and Sophia seemed to hear the distance in it anyway, the sense that something had already shifted even if no lines had technically been crossed. "I want to fix this," Sophia said instead of pressing further, her voice small in a way he hadn't heard from her in years. "Us, whatever this is, tell me what changed." He couldn't tell her the truth. He gave her the closest version of it he could survive saying out loud. "I realized I was building my whole future around someone without ever checking whether she was building hers around me the same way. I don't know how to unknow that." Sophia promised she would prove herself. For a while, genuinely, achingly, she did. She came home earlier, she asked about his work instead of only her own. She stopped taking the late calls from Daniel that Ethan remembered eventually becoming a fixture of their worst years. It created something Ethan hadn't expected, doubt. Real doubt, not performed for anyone's benefit. Watching her try, watching her be, in this exact moment, a woman capable of loving him honestly, he found himself asking a question that had no comfortable answer. What if she never would have cheated, if I hadn't already failed her the first time, in a life she doesn't even remember living? He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure one existed. All he could do was watch and wait, and hope the answer would eventually make itself clear one way or the other. Flashback, the first anniversary after they'd married in the life he no longer had to live. He remembered a version of Sophia standing in their kitchen, waiting for him to come home from a meeting that had run 4 hours long. A dinner gone cold on the table between 2 unlit candles. He remembered walking in, exhausted, apologizing on autopilot, not really hearing her when she said quietly that she felt like she was disappearing. He remembered thinking at the time that he'd make it up to her once the deal closed. He never had, there had always been another deal. He understood now, with the clarity only distance and death could provide, that Sophia's eventual betrayal had a shape to it that started long before Daniel ever entered the picture. In 100 small absences Ethan had once mistaken for provision. In a marriage he tried to build entirely out of money and never once out of attention. That didn't make what she would eventually do forgivable. But it made him determined, this time not to hand anyone the same opening twice, not Daniel, and not his own neglect. Ethan's confidence, by the start of his 3rd year back, had grown into something dangerously close to arrogance, though he wouldn't have called it that at the time. He remembered, or believed he remembered, a mid-sized textile manufacturer that would go up for sale that spring. A company that, in his first life, he'd only heard about secondhand, years after the fact, as an example of a deal someone else had gotten spectacularly rich from. He decided to acquire it himself this time, certain the acquisition would repeat itself exactly as he recalled. A quiet undervaluation, a fast turnaround, a payout that would fund the rest of his independent portfolio for years. He moved faster than he should have. He skipped 2 rounds of due diligence he would normally have insisted on, trusting his memory of the outcome more than the actual paperwork in front of him. The very mistake, dressed in new clothes, that he'd promised himself after the boardroom betrayal he would never make again. The deal collapsed within 4 months. The company's real financials, once Ethan finally looked closely enough, told a story his memory hadn't accounted for at all. A labor dispute 2 years prior had gutted their most profitable contracts. An event that, in his first life, simply hadn't been visible to him from the distance of second-hand rumor. He'd remembered the destination, a company that eventually thrived, without understanding that the version of it he was buying now, in this altered timeline, had already taken a different road to get there. He lost a significant portion of what he'd built. Not everything his other investments held, and his core company was still untouched, but enough to shake him badly in a way the earlier, easier wins never had. "You said you had a good feeling about this one too," Claire said afterward, not gloating, just concerned, watching him stare at a spreadsheet of losses he hadn't expected to ever see again in this life. "I was wrong," Ethan admitted, and the words cost him more than the money had. "I think I've been assuming the future still owes me a map. It doesn't, not anymore. Every choice I've made has already moved us somewhere the old map doesn't cover." It was a harder lesson than any of the ones Daniel or Sophia would eventually teach him, because it came without a villain to blame. There was no betrayal in this failure, no manipulation, no crime to eventually expose. There was only a man who had leaned too hard on a gift he no longer fully understood and paid the ordinary, unglamorous price for it. "So what happens now?" Claire asked. "If you can't trust it anymore," Ethan thought about that for a long moment before answering. "Then I do what everyone else has always had to do," he said. "I make decisions with the information I actually have, instead of the information I wish I still had." It was, in its own quiet way, the moment he finally stopped being a man performing a rerun and started being a man simply living his life, uncertain, occasionally wrong, and responsible for the outcome either way. Chapter 8. Daniel's resentment didn't announce itself. It grew the way most quiet betrayals do, in small comparisons, in conversations that circled back again and again to what Ethan had and what Daniel didn't. Ethan's independent portfolio had grown enough that people had started to notice, and notice meant questions, and questions meant Daniel eventually cornering him at a mutual friend's engagement party, 2 drinks in, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy," Daniel said. "Feels like you don't need me for anything anymore." "I needed you for plenty," Ethan said carefully. "I just stopped needing you for everything. There's a difference." It should have ended there. In Ethan's memory, it hadn't. This was roughly the point where Daniel had begun spending more time at Sophia's studio, ostensibly to discuss a potential partnership. In reality, laying the groundwork for something Ethan hadn't understood until it was already 3 years deep. This time, Ethan watched it happen in real time and made himself stay calm enough to see the mechanism instead of just the wound. It started with sympathy. Daniel began telling Sophia, in small offhand comments Ethan wasn't meant to hear, that Ethan seemed different lately, distant, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. He wasn't wrong exactly, which was what made it so effective. He positioned himself patiently as the person who noticed Sophia when Ethan's attention was elsewhere, the person who asked how her day was and actually waited for the answer. Ethan recognized the pattern because he'd lived on the other side of it. The version of himself who'd been too absent to notice a friend quietly filling the space he'd left behind. He tried once to warn Sophia directly, choosing his words as carefully as he'd ever chosen anything. "I think Daniel's been leaning on you more than he should," he said one evening, watching her reaction closely. "The late calls, the extra time at the studio, I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want you to notice it the way I'm noticing it." Sophia bristled, exactly the way he remembered her bristling the first time he'd raised something similar 4 years too late in his first life. "He's my business partner, Ethan. He believes in what I'm building. Is that a crime now?" "No," he said again, more gently this time, hearing the defensiveness in her voice and understanding it wasn't really aimed at him. It was aimed at a question she wasn't ready to ask herself yet. "I'm not trying to make you choose between us and your business. I'm asking you to notice when a friendship starts asking for things a friendship doesn't usually need." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, arms crossed, looking somewhere past him at nothing in particular. "You've changed this year," she said finally. "I can't always tell if it's a good thing." "Neither can I some days," Ethan admitted, and it was, in its own strange way, the most honest thing he'd said to her in months. "No," Ethan said, "but believing in what you're building and wanting something more than that aren't always different things. I just want you to keep your eyes open, that's all I'm asking." She didn't storm off. She sat with it, visibly uncomfortable. And for a moment Ethan thought he saw something shift behind her eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe, of a truth she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. "You're not usually like this," she said quietly. "Suspicious, careful." "I've had a hard year," Ethan said, which had become, by now, the closest thing he had to an honest answer he could actually give her. The business side of the threat was easier to manage than the emotional one, if only because Ethan understood spreadsheets better than he understood his own marriage. He restructured his company's cap table that quarter, moving Daniel from a position with informal influence over vendor contracts into one with none at all, framed, carefully, as a promotion into strategic partnerships. A title with a nicer sound and considerably less access. Daniel took the change at face value, flattered by the new title, unaware he'd just been quietly locked out of the one place in Ethan's business where, in another life, he'd first learned how to move money without anyone noticing. He didn't confront Sophia with accusations he couldn't yet prove. Instead, one night, he told her something he should have said years earlier in the life he remembered. "If you ever get to a point where you want someone else," he said, "I need you to leave me first, before anything happens, not after." Sophia looked stricken. "Why would you say that?" "Because I'd rather lose you cleanly than lose myself finding out the other way," he said, and watched her promise with real conviction that it would never come to that. He wanted to believe her. Some nights, watching her fall asleep beside him, he almost did. But the promotion he'd engineered for Daniel had an unintended consequence Ethan hadn't fully accounted for. With less access to Ethan's business, Daniel simply redirected his ambition toward Sophia's. And Sophia, flattered by the attention of a man who seemed endlessly available in a way Ethan, splitting his time between 2 companies now sometimes wasn't, began leaning on him more, not less. Ethan saw it happening and understood with a sick, familiar feeling that closing one door had quietly opened another. He'd spent 2 years assuming the danger was mostly financial, that if he protected his money and his company, the rest would hold. He was beginning to realize that Daniel's real weapon had never been Ethan's accounts. It had been proximity, patience, and the particular corrosive kindness of a man who made himself indispensable exactly where Ethan was thinnest. It was the first time since waking up in his old apartment that Ethan understood with real fear that his foresight had limits. He could remember the destination. He was starting to realize he no longer fully controlled the road. Chapter 9. It happened on the exact night Ethan remembered, in the exact office above the design studio, though everything around that single fixed point had changed. He'd built his own company by then, smaller than the one he remembered losing, but entirely defensibly his, with contracts Daniel had never touched and finances Daniel had never seen. He'd spent 2 years making himself impossible to rob blind. He hadn't managed in the end to make himself impossible to betray. He almost didn't go. He remembered the date circled in his memory for 2 straight years, remembered dreading it the way a man dreads a scheduled surgery he can't cancel. And some tired, self-protective part of him had considered, that morning, simply staying away and letting whatever happened happen without a witness. But he'd promised himself 2 years earlier that he would face this night honestly, whatever it cost him, rather than spend the rest of his life wondering what he might have seen if he'd only had the courage to look. So he went. He drove to the studio with the contracts on the passenger seat, rehearsing nothing, because there was nothing left to rehearse. Either the night would happen the way he remembered, or it wouldn't, and either way he'd finally know for certain which version of Sophia he'd spent 2 years falling back in love with. He walked in to drop off a set of contracts Sophia had asked him to review, and found Daniel's jacket over the back of a chair that wasn't his. And Sophia's face when she saw him standing in the doorway told him everything before either of them spoke a single word. It wasn't a shock, not really. He'd known this night was coming for 2 years. He'd built an entire second life in preparation for it. And still it hollowed him out exactly the way it had the first time, because knowing a wound is coming doesn't make it hurt less when it finally arrives. Sophia started crying immediately. Daniel started explaining, the way guilty people always do, words tumbling out that meant nothing. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't throw anything, didn't demand answers he'd already spent 2 years assembling on his own. He simply looked at the woman he'd loved for most of his adult life, in 2 lives now, and asked the only question that actually mattered to him. Was I wrong to give you another chance? Sophia couldn't answer. Her silence was the answer. Ethan turned and walked out, and this time, unlike the last, he wasn't walking toward a decade of quiet destruction he wouldn't notice until it was finished. He was walking toward the parts of his life he'd already spent 2 years protecting. A company Daniel had no access to, a fortune Daniel didn't know existed, a version of himself Daniel had never gotten close enough to hollow out. Behind him he heard Sophia call his name once, her voice breaking on the single syllable, and he made himself keep walking anyway. Not out of cruelty. Because he understood, with a clarity that had taken him 2 lives to earn, that turning around in that moment, accepting whatever explanation she was about to offer, forgiving her before the wound had even finished forming, would only teach both of them the wrong lesson. It would tell Sophia that betrayal came with a built-in second chance, offered the instant she was caught. And it would tell him that he was still, after everything, the same man who confused endurance with love. He got in his car and sat in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. His hands steady in a way that surprised him, his chest hollowed out in a way that didn't. Grief, he was learning, didn't always announce itself with the same intensity twice. The first time on that rooftop years from now that would never happen, it had arrived as total devastation, a life ending in real time. This time it arrived quieter, more like mourning something he'd already, privately, said goodbye to months earlier. The moment he'd first watched Daniel's hand linger too long on Sophia's shoulder and understood, without needing proof yet, exactly where this road led. The second life had finally separated itself from the first. He didn't go home that night. He walked for hours instead, through streets that had changed just enough over 2 years to feel unfamiliar, replaying every version of this exact scene he'd carried inside himself since the rooftop. The fall, the rain, Daniel's flat voice explaining that Ethan had been useful but never exceptional. He'd expected, if this night ever came again, to feel the same devastation he remembered from the first time. Instead, he felt something closer to grief mixed with a strange, unwelcome relief. The particular relief of finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying, bracing for 2 straight years. Claire called him twice that night. He didn't answer either time, not because he didn't want to hear her voice, but because he needed, for just a few hours, to be a man who had lost something without immediately reaching for the person waiting to help him feel better about it. He owed the loss that much respect even now. He answered on the third call near 2 in the morning, sitting on a bench outside a building he barely recognized. "I heard," Claire said simply. She didn't ask if he was okay. She'd learned over the past 2 years that he rarely answered that question honestly when it was asked directly. Do you want company or do you want to be alone? I don't know yet, Ethan admitted. That's fine, she said. I'll be up, call me when you decide. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after she hung up, and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with foresight or memory that the difference between his first life and this one wasn't really about the money he'd protected or the crimes he'd eventually expose. It was this, a woman on the other end of a phone line who didn't need him to perform strength he didn't have, who let him decide, on his own terms, how to carry a grief that was entirely his to carry. He called her back an hour later. She met him at the bench without a single question about why it had taken him that long, and simply sat beside him until the sun came up. Chapter 10, Ethan didn't burn Sophia's company to the ground out of spite, and he told himself repeatedly that this restraint mattered, that whatever else this second chance had cost him, he wasn't going to spend it becoming a man he'd hate. What he did instead was quieter, and far more devastating to the man who deserved it. He'd spent 2 years watching Daniel's business dealings from a careful distance, and what he found, once he finally started looking with intent instead of denial, was worse than anything he remembered from his first life, not because the crimes were bigger, but because this time Ethan had the patience and the resources to actually prove them. Manipulated contracts. Money quietly siphoned from 2 other investors who trusted Daniel exactly the way Ethan once had. A pattern, going back years, of a man who built his success on other people's blind spots. Claire helped him build the case, though at first she didn't know what it would ultimately be used for. She was simply the sharpest financial mind Ethan knew, and the discrepancies in Daniel's numbers were the kind of thing she caught in her sleep. These accounts don't reconcile, she told him one night, spreading printouts across his kitchen table. Someone's been moving money to cover a hole that keeps getting bigger. I know, Ethan said quietly. I've known for a while. Claire looked up at him, and something in his face must have told her this wasn't purely a business conversation anymore. This is personal, she said. It wasn't a question. It's about to become very public instead, Ethan said, which is worse for him. He didn't want Sophia's ruin. He wanted the truth laid out clearly enough that no one could look away from it, including her. I wanted justice, Ethan told Claire later, when she asked him why he wasn't going further, why he wasn't burning both of them to nothing when he clearly had the means to. I don't want to become a monster to get it. The case they built took the better part of 4 months. Claire mapped the shell entities Daniel had used to root money out of 2 other investors' accounts. Entities with names bland enough to disappear into any spreadsheet, holding companies with 3-letter acronyms and addresses that turned out, when Claire finally cross-referenced them, to be the same rented mailbox in a strip mall 2 towns over. Ethan handled the harder, slower work of quietly notifying the investors Daniel had already burned once. In confidence, giving them enough evidence to start asking their own questions without ever revealing that the information had come from him. It wasn't clean. One of the investors, a nervous man named Whitfield who'd put nearly half his savings into Daniel's fund, initially accused Ethan of orchestrating the whole thing for his own benefit. A fair suspicion, given how neatly it would resolve Ethan's own grievance against the man. Ethan let the accusation stand rather than defend himself with information he couldn't yet explain the source of, and simply kept handing Whitfield verifiable numbers until the numbers did the convincing on their own. You could lose your reputation over this if it goes wrong, Claire warned him one night, the 2 of them surrounded by printouts at his kitchen table for what felt like the 100th time. People will ask why you were the one digging. Let them ask, Ethan said. I'd rather be the man who dug too much than the man who didn't dig at all. I've already lived that version once. Claire didn't ask what he meant by that. She'd stopped asking weeks earlier about the strange certainty that sometimes crossed his face before events confirmed it. Deciding, in the practical way she decided most things, that whatever was driving him, it wasn't malice. And that was enough for her to keep helping. There were nights during those 4 months when the work felt less like justice and more like grief management. A way of channeling 2 years of carefully suppressed anger into something productive instead of letting it curdle into bitterness. Claire noticed that too, eventually, setting down her pen one evening to actually look at him instead of the numbers between them. You don't have to prove you're not becoming him, she said quietly, meaning Daniel, meaning the ruthlessness Ethan sometimes seemed afraid of catching like an illness. I've watched you build this whole case without cutting a single corner you didn't have to. That's not what a monster looks like. Feels like one some nights, Ethan admitted. Feeling like one and being one aren't the same thing, Claire said. Why no. You've clearly met the real version up close. He laughed, quietly, surprised at how much lighter the joke made the whole exhausting project feel. and understood, not for the first time, exactly why he'd chosen to build this second life around a woman who refused to let him disappear into his own worst assumptions about himself. Chapter 11. Daniel came to him 3 weeks later, once the first quiet inquiries from his investors had started, once he understood that someone had handed them a trail too clean to be an accident. "How did you know?" he demanded, standing in the doorway of Ethan's office, all the old charm gone from his face. "Every move I made, the accounts, the contracts, the timing. It's like you saw it coming before I did." Ethan considered lying. It would have been easier. Instead, tired of carrying the whole truth alone for 2 years, he said it plainly. "Because I already watched you destroy my life once." Daniel laughed, short and disbelieving. "Why, you're insane." "I know things I shouldn't know," Ethan said. "I knew about the logistics deal before it collapsed. I knew you'd start pulling away from our shared accounts the moment I stopped needing you. I knew, almost to the week, when you'd end up in that office with Sophia." He watched the disbelief on Daniel's face curdle into something closer to fear as Ethan kept going, describing conversations that hadn't happened yet in this version of events. Decisions Daniel hadn't made yet but would have, the exact shape of a downfall that in another life had been Ethan's instead. "That's not possible," Daniel said, but quieter now. "I don't need you to believe me," Ethan said. "I just needed you to understand that you never once had the advantage you thought you had." Daniel left without another word, and Ethan understood that whatever was coming next, Daniel would not go quietly. He was right. Within days, Daniel began working the only angle he had left, not Ethan's finances, which were locked down tight, and not Ethan's reputation, which had only grown steadier over the past 2 years, but the story itself. He started telling mutual acquaintances that Ethan had been unstable lately, prone to strange accusations and stranger certainties. A man who'd clearly cracked under the pressure of his own success. It was a clever move. Ethan had to admit, plant enough doubt about his sanity, and the eventual fraud case would look less like justice, and more like the deranged vendetta of a man losing his grip. It might even have worked if Claire's evidence hadn't been so thoroughly, boringly documented. Numbers didn't care how stable or unstable the person presenting them seemed. Numbers simply were what they were, and Daniel's numbers told a story no character assassination could unwrite. Ethan let the rumors circulate without responding to a single one of them. "Silence isn't losing," he told Claire when she asked if he wanted help getting ahead of the narrative. "Sometimes it's just waiting for the other person to run out of things to say." Chapter 12. Daniel's last move was not aimed at Ethan directly. It was aimed at Claire. He'd correctly identified in the end the one part of Ethan's second life that hadn't existed in the first, the one variable he couldn't find any history for because there wasn't any. Daniel began spreading quiet rumors about impropriety in Claire's firm, insinuating she'd used privileged information to help Ethan build his portfolio, threatening the reputation she'd spent years building on nothing but her own competence. It was, Ethan realized with a cold clarity, exactly the kind of move a desperate man makes when he's run out of better ones. It was also a mistake. Claire didn't panic. She did what she'd always done better than almost anyone Ethan had ever met. She went back to the numbers. Digging through Daniel's own financial trail in search of anything that might explain the rumor's origin, she found something Ethan himself hadn't managed to unearth in 2 years of careful searching. A direct link between Daniel and the exact fraudulent transactions that, in another life, had eventually taken down Ethan's entire company. "He's been doing this for 6 years, Claire told him, laying it all out with the same steady precision she'd once used to dismantle a bad investment thesis of his own. "Not just with you, with 3 other companies before yours. YO weren't his only mistake, YO were just the last one." Ethan didn't need to fight Daniel directly. The evidence did what it had always been going to do once someone finally had the patience and the reason to assemble it properly. Within a month, Daniel lost his company, his investors, his reputation, in the same industry circles where he'd once been the golden, trusted friend everyone wanted at their table. Everything he had built on the foundation of Ethan's trust came apart at once, the way things built on borrowed foundations tend to. The formal proceedings took another 6 weeks, depositions. A hastily assembled legal team on Daniel's side that quit 2 weeks in once it became clear how deep the paper trail actually went. A settlement conference that ended with Daniel signing over what remained of his stake in 3 separate ventures just to avoid a criminal referral. Ethan sat through most of it in silence, letting Claire and the lawyers do the talking, watching a man who had once stood at his wedding shrink, meeting by meeting, into someone smaller than Ethan remembered him ever being, even at the very end of his first life. There was a moment near the close of the final meeting when Daniel caught Ethan's eye across the conference table, not with anger anymore, but something closer to bewildered exhaustion. "I don't understand how you saw all of this coming," Daniel said quietly, mostly to himself. You never really tried to understand me, Ethan said. That was always the problem. Yo just assumed you already knew everything about what I'd let you get away with. Sophia hadn't come to the settlement conference, but she'd sent word through her lawyer that she wanted no part of Daniel's remaining assets and no continued involvement in his ventures. A small, quiet act of separation that Ethan hadn't expected and, against his own inclination to remain hardened toward her, found himself grateful for. It told him something he'd wondered about for months. That whatever else Sophia had done, she hadn't lost the capacity to recognize, once the truth was fully in front of her, exactly what kind of man Daniel actually was. He felt no satisfaction watching Daniel gather his things and leave. He'd expected to. He'd spent 2 years in some buried corner of himself, imagining exactly this moment and rehearsing exactly how good it would feel. Instead it simply felt finished, a debt paid, a door closed, nothing left behind it worth walking back through. Outside the building afterward, Whitfield caught up with him on the sidewalk, the nervous investor who'd once accused Ethan of orchestrating the whole affair for his own benefit. He looked older than he had 4 months earlier, but steadier too, the way people look once a long uncertainty finally resolves itself. I owe you an apology, Whitfield said. I thought you were settling a score and calling it justice. I was settling a score, Ethan said honestly. I just made sure the facts were true before I let myself act on it. That's the only difference that matters in the end. Whitfield extended a hand, and Ethan shook it and understood that this, a stranger's trust, rebuilt out of nothing but patient, verifiable truth, mattered to him more than anything Daniel's downfall had cost the man personally. He hadn't done this to feel powerful. He'd done it so that men like Whitfield wouldn't have to learn, the way Ethan once had, exactly how much damage a trusted man could do while everyone around him kept assuming the best. Chapter 13. Sophia asked to see him one final time, in a coffee shop neither of them had ever been to together, neutral ground for a conversation that had been 2 years coming. She looked smaller than he remembered, not physically, but in some way he couldn't quite name, like a person who had finally run out of explanations. Did you ever love me? She asked. I loved you enough to nearly destroy myself for you, Ethan said. And it was true in ways she would never fully understand, in a life she would never know she'd lived twice. She cried quietly the way people cry when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. Could you ever forgive me? I already did, Ethan said. She looked up surprised, something like hope flickering across her face before he continued. Forgiving you doesn't mean I have to come back to you, he said, gently but without room for misunderstanding. I'm not angry anymore. I don't need you to suffer for this, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life waiting to see if you've changed enough to deserve another chance you already had. Sophia absorbed that in silence, and something in her expression finally settled not peace exactly, but understanding. She realized, watching him, that his restraint over these past 2 years hadn't been mercy performed for her benefit. It had never been about her at all, not really. It had been about who Ethan refused to become in the process of surviving her. I hope you're happy, she said finally, and for the first time in either version of their life together, Ethan believed she meant it. She stood to leave, then hesitated, one hand resting on the back of her chair. Can I ask you something strange? Go ahead. Sometimes, over the last 2 years, you looked at me like you already knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. Like you were watching a rerun of something instead of living it. She studied his face carefully. What was that? Ethan considered for the first time, actually telling her, laying out the rooftop, the fall, the decade he'd apparently lived twice. He decided against it, not out of cruelty, but because he understood, finally, that the explanation wouldn't change anything for her. It would only give her one more thing to carry out of a relationship that had already cost her enough. I think some people just learn to see patterns early, he said instead. I saw one in us before you did, that's all. She didn't fully believe him. He could see that in the slight tilt of her head, the same look she used to give him when he was hiding something small and harmless. But she let it go, the way people eventually let go of questions they suspect will hurt more than the not knowing. Goodbye, Ethan, she said. Goodbye, Sophia. He watched her walk out of the coffee shop, and for the first time since he'd opened his eyes in that old apartment, felt something in his chest unclench that had been tight for 2 straight years, not happiness exactly, but its close, exhausted cousin. The feeling of finally, completely putting something down. Chapter 14, he chose Claire not suddenly, not as a reward for surviving everything else, but slowly, the way anything worth keeping is built. They didn't rush toward marriage the way he and Sophia once had. They built a company together first, arguing over strategy the way they'd once argued over spreadsheets, learning each other's worst mornings and best instincts in equal measure. There were setbacks, a partnership that fell through, a product launch that failed in its first attempt, ordinary disappointments that had nothing to do with betrayal or revenge, and everything to do with simply building a life. Ethan found, to his quiet astonishment, that he didn't already know how those disappointments would end. His foresight had run its course somewhere in the last 2 years, spent down to nothing by every choice he'd made differently. From here on, he was living blind the way everyone else always had. It should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like relief. He proposed to Claire almost by accident in the middle of an argument about a supplier contract neither of them could agree on, when she said something so precisely, infuriatingly correct that he'd stopped mid-sentence and simply looked at her for a long moment. "What?" she said, defensive, misreading his silence for disagreement. "Nothing, you're just right again." He shook his head, half laughing at himself. "I don't want to argue about contracts with anyone else for the rest of my life. That's a strange way to propose if that's what you're doing." "I don't have a ring on me," Ethan admitted. "I wasn't planning this." "Good," Claire said, setting down the contract entirely, something unguarded finally breaking through the careful composure she wore like armor most days. "I never liked planned things as much as everyone assumes I would. Ask me again when you mean it." He asked her again 3 weeks later, properly this time, with a ring he'd chosen carefully and none of the desperate urgency that had driven his first proposal a lifetime ago. She said yes without crying, which surprised him until he understood that this Claire didn't need the moment to prove anything to either of them. She simply already knew, with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything else, that the answer had been decided long before he'd found the right words to ask the question. Their wedding was small, deliberately so, populated by people who had earned their place there rather than people Ethan felt obligated to invite out of old habit. Daniel wasn't on the list. Sophia sent a card from the city she'd relocated to, brief and kind, and Ethan kept it in a drawer for reasons he didn't examine too closely. One evening, months after Daniel's company had finished collapsing, and Sophia had moved to another city to start over somewhere Ethan didn't know and no longer needed to, Claire asked him a question he hadn't expected. "If you knew everything that was going to happen," she said, "would you change anything?" Ethan thought about the rooftop. About Sophia's kitchen, the flower on her hands, the ring he never bought. About Daniel's easy grin the last time it had meant anything. About 2 years spent so carefully controlling every outcome he could reach that he'd nearly forgotten how to simply live inside one. "Yes," he said. "What?" He smiled and reached for her hand across the table. "I'd stopped trying to control everything." Epilogue. Years later, Ethan stood outside the headquarters of the company he and Claire had built together, watching the morning light move across glass that belonged to no one but them. The building wasn't the tallest in the district, and Ethan had made sure of that deliberately. He turned down 2 opportunities to expand into flashier, taller offices, choosing instead to keep the company at a size he and Claire could still walk through in 20 minutes and know almost everyone's name. It was a small decision that had nothing to do with foresight and everything to do with the kind of life he decided, slowly and deliberately, that he actually wanted to live. Claire stood beside him, the way she had for most of the years that mattered, a coffee in each hand, one of which she passed to him without either of them needing to ask. Their son was 7 now, inside somewhere with the company's earliest employees, who had long ago stopped treating him as an interruption to the workday and started treating him as a small, opinionated fixture of it. Ethan hadn't remembered a son in his first life, because there hadn't been one, just an empty nursery Sophia had once, in a different version of their marriage, insisted they didn't have time to plan for yet. He thought about that sometimes without bitterness. The absence had simply been part of a life that no longer existed, replaced by a small, loud, curious boy who currently believed his father's company built computer money, a description close enough to the truth that Ethan had never bothered correcting it. There was no revenge left to plan. No enemies left circling. No betrayal waiting quietly around some future corner for him to brace against. For the first time since he'd opened his eyes in that old apartment a decade ago, Ethan realized he had stopped living like a man bracing for a second fall. He thought standing there about the boardroom he'd once signed his life away in a version of events that had never happened here and never would. He thought about the rooftop, the rain, Daniel's flat, dismissive voice. He thought about Sophia's kitchen, the flower on her hands, the ring he'd never bought her. Each memory had lost the sharp, breathless terror it once carried, not because he'd forgotten any of it, but because none of it had power over him anymore. It had become simply a story about a man he used to be, in a life that had quietly, thoroughly stopped being his. His second life hadn't been a gift because he could predict a market, or dismantle a friend's crimes, or avoid a woman who would one day stop loving him. It had never really been about outsmarting the future at all, though it had taken him the better part of a decade to understand that clearly. It was a gift because he had finally understood something his first life, and his death, had never managed to teach him. A person's greatest failure isn't trusting the wrong person once. It's refusing, afterward, to learn anything from it. He'd trusted Daniel blindly and paid for it. He'd trusted his own certainty about the future blindly too, in that failed textile deal. and paid for that as well in a smaller but no less instructive way. The lesson, it turned out, had never been about who to trust and who to punish. It had been about the difference between trust that was earned, moment by moment, through attention and honesty, and trust that was simply assumed because it was convenient. Ethan took Claire's hand. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, the same question she'd asked him 100 times over the years, never quite losing her curiosity about the parts of him she couldn't always read. "That I got lucky," he said. "You always say that," Claire said, smiling. "Why, you never say how." He looked at her for a long moment at the life they'd built out of ordinary choices, unremarkable mornings, arguments settled honestly instead of buried, a marriage built on actually paying attention instead of merely providing for someone from a careful, guarded distance. It was, in every way that mattered, the opposite of the life he'd once lost. "Someday I'll tell you the whole story," he said. "Just not today, I'll hold you to that." "I know you will." Their son came running out the front doors just then, breathless with some small, urgent piece of news about a broken vending machine, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of being a father. A kind of interruption Ethan had once, in a life he barely recognized as his own anymore, never had the patience to properly enjoy. He crouched down to hear the whole story about the vending machine in exhaustive detail, nodding along with real attention, and Claire watched him do it with the particular fondness of someone who had learned, over many years, exactly how rare and hard-won that attention actually was. Behind them was the life he had lost and rebuilt and finally let go of. Ahead of them was the one he had chosen, one ordinary, unremarkable day at a time. And for the first time in either life, Ethan Carter wasn't living to rewrite his past. He was living simply and completely because he wanted his future. End.